So in this short lecture, I'm going to talk about the hormones that control metabolism and the hypothalamus pituitary organ axis and its role within the regulation of metabolism. So in general, why do we need hormones? Well, you have a need to regulate your plasma content. The availability of substrate varies and your demand varies. You have sporadic feeding and you have a variable energy expenditure. Also, the rates of absorption of substrate through the GI tract is just not regulated. Your body will try and absorb as much as it can. And so you need to regulate then the end points of these substrates as they come into the bloodstream, and if they fall too low, then you need to mobilize your storage. And just taking blood glucose as an example, if it gets too low, your nervous system is going to shut down and you'll go into a coma. And if it gets too high, there are also consequences, particularly in the long term, with damage through osmotic problems with the vasculature. And so, in order to regulate the plasma content of substrates, your body utilizes hormones to send a systemic signal of what to do with the substrates that are either accumulating or depleting in your blood. Normal blood glucose levels are maintained around 70 to 100 in the fasting individual, and then after eating it can get up to 140 mg per deciliter. And generally there's two ways to get to modulate your blood glucose levels. You can put it into the system or you can take it out. And so the hormones just then guide which direction this goes in. These are the hormones that you're going to need for this block. Need to know about insulin, which is the main anabolic hormone of the body, and it puts pretty much everything into storage. And then the rest of them are mainly catabolic. Glucagon, which produces glucose and fatty acids from storage. Epinephrine does the same thing. Actually, glucagon and epinephrine reinforce each other's activity. Then you have growth hormone, which turns energy towards glucose and fats again and protects muscle. And then cortisol, which produces glucose from protein. And then you have the thyroid hormone, which you can think of as your body's thermostat. The more thyroid hormone you have, the more metabolically active pretty much every cell in the body is. Here are the places they come from. You have growth hormone coming from the pituitary gland. Thyroid hormone comes from the thyroid gland in the neck. Cortisol and epinephrine come from the adrenal glands. Cortisol coming from the cortex, epinephrine coming from the medulla. And then you have the pancreas, which secretes both insulin and glucagon. This is a diagram of the hypothalamus and pituitary organ. At the top we have the hypothalamus, and obviously this has a load of neuronal inputs from temperature, from stress, and it responds then to all these inputs, and it then modulates your activity by releasing hormones through the pituitary. And there are two lobes. You have the posterior pituitary, which secretes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And then the anterior pituitary creates and stores ACTH, TSH, LH and FSH, growth hormone and prolactin. And there are hormones that come from the hypothalamus and are passed out. ADH and oxytocin are actually made in the hypothalamus and passed down through nerve terminals into the blood. But then for the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus creates hormones that are sent down through this portal vein into the anterior pituitary to then stimulate these hormones that are created in the anterior pituitary that are then passed out to affect target cells. Here are hormones that are passed down from the pituitary and what they do. You have thyrotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates TSH release, and also stimulates a release of prolactin. Then you have corticotropin releasing hormone that stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. You have growth hormone releasing hormone that releases growth hormone, and then somatostatin or growth hormone inhibiting hormone that inhibits the release of growth hormone, TSH, and prolactin. The other hormones here are mainly involved in reproduction, and we're not really going to talk about them in this block. So as I said earlier, the hypothalamus creates hormones, and then they're released directly through the posterior pituitary. And this is antidiuretic hormone that regulates blood volume, and then oxytocin that's also involved in reproduction. You should know at least what these two are called and what they do. And then the anterior pituitary, which will be the main focus in this block, releases several hormones that I've already mentioned: ACTH, TSH, LH, FSH, and prolactin. And we're going to be most interested in ACTH and TSH in this block. And obviously growth hormone then is released, and it's one of the prominent hormones of this block also. And so to reiterate that, you have growth hormone, and this will stimulate the release of IGF from the liver, which stimulates growth, but it also has a control function on the metabolism directly. Then we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, and this stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. And it has tropic activity on this cortex, meaning the more of it that is released, the more the cortex will grow. And then we have thyroid stimulating hormone that stimulates the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid glands. And this also has a tropic activity on the thyroid glands. It's important to note how this hypothalamus pituitary organ axis functions. There's a very strong feedback mechanism in the release of these hormones that maintains the concentration of these in the blood and prevents them getting too high. And there are several feedback loops. You have the ultra short feedback loop, which is the hypothalamus releasing a hormone that inhibits its own release. Then you have the short loop, where anterior pituitary hormones feed back onto the hypothalamus and inhibit the release of hormones from the hypothalamus. And then you have long loop, where the end terminal organ will release a hormone that then feeds back onto both the pituitary and the hypothalamus to inhibit the release of the hormones from those different parts of the axis. And understanding how this works then has diagnostic value in the clinic.